My mother told me I was being removed from the future while she was wearing the pearl earrings I gave her for her 60th birthday. That is the detail I remember most clearly. Not the attorney's polished walnut table, not my cousin's expensive watch, not even the sentence explaining that the house I had been helping my parents keep for 7 years would eventually belong to someone else. I remember those pearls moving when my mother nodded, as if what was happening were sad but sensible, like putting down an old dog. I was 38 then, old enough to know that families can hurt you without raising their voices, and still young enough to be shocked when mine did it with paperwork. The meeting was in Bellwether, North Carolina, 45 minutes from my apartment in Charlotte. My mother, Gloria Rowan, had texted me 3 days earlier. "We're updating some legal things. We need you there Thursday afternoon." I arrived expecting to help organize their affairs. Instead, when the receptionist opened the conference room, I saw my Aunt Cynthia first. Cynthia Harlow was my mother's older sister and the family's unofficial minister of fairness, despite having a definition of fairness that usually meant somebody else should sacrifice. Beside her sat her son, Mason, 41, father of 2, owner of a failed boutique fitness studio, and a successful talent for looking injured whenever consequences approached him. My parents sat on the other side of the table. My father, Daniel, kept rubbing his thumb along the rim of a paper cup. He had spent 39 years repairing commercial heating systems. He could diagnose a compressor by sound from 20 feet away. Human conflict made him nearly mute. There was an empty chair between my mother and the attorney. "It was mine." "Paige," my mother said brightly, "there you are." I sat. No one asked about my drive. Elise Carver folded her hands. "Your parents asked that you be present because they want clarity now rather than confusion later." That sentence turned out to be the only kindness in the room. My parents had transferred their home, most of their savings, my father's truck, and several small accounts into a revocable trust. After both of them died, the remaining assets would pass to Mason. Not to me. Mason. The cousin, whose business failure had created the mortgage I had been paying. The attorney read the exclusion language carefully. It said I had been considered. It said the omission was deliberate. It said my parents loved me and trusted that I would understand their reasons. I remember staring at the grain in the table and thinking that some carpenter had spent more time matching those boards than my family had spent imagining what this would feel like. My mother reached over and covered my hand. Her palm was warm. "Please don't make this into something it isn't," she said. "You're doing well. Mason has the children. He needs stability more than you do." I looked at Mason. He looked back with the expression people wear when they have received something they want, but would prefer not to admit they wanted it. Cynthia leaned forward. "Paige, you have a career. You've always landed on your feet. Mason's girls need roots." I asked, "And the mortgage?" No one answered immediately. That pause was the beginning of the end. To understand it, you have to go back 7 years. Mason opened a fitness studio called Forge House Athletic in a shopping center outside Greensboro. He had investors, branded towels, neon lighting, a wall slogan about becoming your strongest self, and absolutely no idea how to manage cash flow. Within 18 months, he was in trouble. He told my parents he needed temporary capital to keep the studio alive until a corporate wellness contract came through. He did not tell me. If he had, I would have asked to see the lease, payroll, debt schedule, membership retention, and actual contract. Mason did not want questions. He wanted belief. My mother and Cynthia gave him belief. My father gave him the house. My parents took out a new loan against a property they had nearly finished paying for and handed Mason $92,000. I learned about it after the closing. I learned because my father had shortness of breath one night and ended up in the emergency room, where a cardiologist told us that his heart function had declined. 2 weeks later, while I was sorting medications at my parents' kitchen table, I saw the new mortgage statement under a pharmacy receipt. The monthly payment was $1,650, including taxes and insurance. I thought there had been a mistake. My mother cried before I even finished reading it. "Mason is going to repay us," she said. "It's just complicated right now." My father stared at the refrigerator. I asked why they had borrowed so much. My mother said, "We couldn't let him lose everything." I remember the exact sensation that moved through me then. Not anger, responsibility. That is the dangerous feeling nobody warns dependable daughters about. Responsibility can arrive wearing the same clothes as love. My parents' retirement income could not absorb the new payment along with my father's medical costs. I had recently received a promotion. I was living in a small apartment, had no children, and had spent most of my adult life being praised for being practical. So I said, "I'll take the payment for a while, just until Mason gets back on track." Forge House Athletic closed 11 months later. Mason never repaid the $92,000. My while lasted 7 years. 84 mortgage payments. Every month, $1,650 left my account and went toward Hawthorne Lane. I also covered the property insurance increase after a storm claim, replaced my mother's transmission when it failed, paid for a new water heater, and handled 3 years of my parents' cell service because moving them onto my plan was simpler. I did ask for protection. Twice. The first time, I suggested a written agreement stating that my mortgage contributions would be recognized in the estate. My mother's face collapsed as if I had requested interest from a homeless stranger. "Paige, this is your home too," she said. "Why would we need a contract between us?" The second time, 3 years later, I asked whether they would add me to the deed or at least document what I had contributed. My father said, "Your mother hates talking about this stuff." My mother said, "The house will come to you eventually. You know that." I wanted to know it badly enough that I treated it as fact. Back in Elise Carver's conference room, I asked my mother again, "What happens to the mortgage if the house goes to Mason?" Cynthia answered before she could. "Why are you making this transactional?" I almost laughed. There was a signed trust sitting 3 feet from me distributing property by name, but apparently the transaction began only when I asked who would pay for it. Mason cleared his throat. "Obviously, when the time comes, I'll take care of whatever's left." "When the time comes," I said. He shrugged. "You know what I mean." I did. He meant after I had financed the asset until it became his. My mother squeezed my hand again. You're not losing a family. You're focusing on a house. That hurt more than the trust. Because for 7 years, whenever I asked for paperwork, she had told me the house represented family. Now that the paperwork favored someone else, I was shallow for caring about the house. I looked at my father. He did not defend me. His eyes stayed on the paper cup. Something in me went quiet. Not numb, quiet. There is a difference. Numbness is when you cannot feel the injury yet. Quiet is when the injury is finally clear enough that you stop arguing with it. I stood, thanked the attorney, put my untouched folder back in my tote, and told everyone I had a contractor call at 4. My mother blinked. That's it. What else is there? I asked. Cynthia said my name in a warning tone. I left anyway. My father followed me into the parking lot. He moved slowly, one hand against the brick wall before stepping off the curb. I had known his heart condition was getting worse, but seeing him winded after one flight of stairs made fear cut through my anger. Dad, you shouldn't have come down. He waved that away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, Your mother thinks she's protecting the family. From what, me? He winced. No. Then say it upstairs. He looked toward the second-floor window. I'm tired, Paige. That sentence broke something different in me. I had been tired for 7 years. Nobody had treated my exhaustion as a reason to stop. My father reached into his jacket and handed me a small key with a faded red plastic cap. The back shop, he said. Keep it. His workshop stood behind the house, really more of a converted detached garage. He kept tools there, old radios, coffee cans full of screws, and pieces of wood he saved because they might become useful someday. Why? I asked. He looked at me then. Because some things in there are yours, whether anybody writes it down or not. It was the closest he came to taking my side that day. It was not enough. It was also the only thing he knew how to give. I drove back to Charlotte with the key in my cup holder and the mortgage draft scheduled for the following Monday. That night, I did not cancel anything. I barely slept. I kept replaying my mother saying I was doing well as if competence were an inheritance I had already received. I remembered every time she had introduced me at church as our independent one, with pride in her voice. I had thought independent meant capable. In that conference room, I learned it also meant dispensable. By morning, I knew anger was not enough. Anger would let them dismiss me. My mother would call me emotional. Cynthia would call me jealous. Mason would call me dramatic. My father would ask everyone to lower their voices. So I treated the situation the way I would treat a project that had lost its funding. I opened every account. I canceled the mortgage transfer, separated my parents from the bills I had been carrying, and moved the repair fund back into savings for my own future. The first mortgage payment failed to arrive. Nothing happened. A week passed. Then, too, no one called. That part hurt in a way I had not expected. After the legal meeting, I had imagined my mother sitting at the kitchen table, wondering whether she had gone too far. I imagined my father calling to say he was sorry. I even imagined Mason sending some awkward message acknowledging that the situation was painful. Instead, my mother sent me a recipe for chicken casserole and a photograph of Mason's daughters at a school concert. No mention of the trust. No mention of me leaving the office pale and silent. The longer nobody asked how I was, the more obvious the architecture of our relationship became. I had confused being consulted about problems with being included in people's lives. Without problems to solve, I received almost nothing. The realization embarrassed me. That was one of the emotions I hated admitting. I was not only angry at them, I was ashamed of myself for having participated so enthusiastically. I had liked being the competent one. I had enjoyed the relief in my mother's voice when I said, "I'll handle it." I had built identity out of rescue because rescue was the safest way I knew to earn affection. That did not make their choices acceptable. But it meant the story was not as simple as me waking up one morning with perfect boundaries. For several weeks, I almost restored the payment 3 different times. Once after waking from a dream where my parents were standing outside the locked house in the rain. Once after my father left a voicemail asking whether I knew a good cardiology practice in Charlotte. And once after I drove past a furniture store and saw a dining table in the window that reminded me of Sunday dinners at Hawthorne Lane. Each time I sat with the panic until it passed. The missed payment became 2. Then, on a Tuesday morning, while I was reviewing revised concrete pricing for a surgical tower, my phone lit up with my mother's name. The message said, "Something is wrong with the mortgage account. The payment hasn't been made. Please fix it today." I typed, "The person receiving the house can take responsibility for its expenses. I won't be making future payments." I read it twice. My heart was pounding hard enough to make my hands cold. Then I sent it. My mother called in less than 5 minutes. I let it ring. She called again. Then Cynthia. Then my mother again. By lunch, Mason had texted, "Seriously, you're doing this now." That sentence almost impressed me. I did not know there had been a more convenient time for me to stop paying for his inheritance. That evening, my mother left a voicemail in the controlled voice she used when she wanted anger to sound like disappointment. "Paige, this is not how adults resolve family disagreements. Your father is under enormous stress. We expected better from you." I listened once. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and cried. Not because I changed my mind. Because boundaries do not erase conditioning. Sometimes you can know you are right and still feel like a frightened child waiting to be told you have ruined everything. On Sunday, Cynthia called. I answered because some part of me still believed I might be able to explain myself into being treated fairly. She began gently. "Your mother hasn't slept. I'm sorry she's upset. You should be more than sorry." There it was. Cynthia talked about sacrifice, about how families take care of weaker members, about how I had no children and therefore more flexibility. She said Mason had made mistakes but was trying. She said my parents had given me every opportunity to become the woman I was. I let her speak until she ran out of momentum. Then I asked, How much are you contributing to the mortgage? Silence. That's not the point. How much is Mason contributing? He has obligations. So do I. You earn more. That was the truth underneath everything. My stability had become communal property. My needs were private because I had been successful at managing them. Cynthia's voice sharpened. You're going to regret choosing money over family. I said, I think the family already chose money. I'm just the first person who stopped pretending otherwise. Then I ended the call. I shook for 20 minutes afterward. The following Monday, Mason appeared at my office and asked me to keep the loan current while everyone figured things out. When I refused, he finally admitted what he was really protecting. He and Brooke had been looking at houses closer to her parents. Their plan, once my parents were gone, was to sell Hawthorne Lane and us. The proceeds to pay down their next home. He said it as if this were merely practical. My parents were alive. My father was sick. My mother still watered geraniums on that porch every morning. And Mason had already converted their house into a future down payment. You've planned around money you don't own from people who are not dead, I said. His face hardened. You always make things sound vicious. I'm repeating what you told me. You know I have 2 kids. And I have one life. 2 mornings later, my father called and asked me to meet him for breakfast. Over coffee, he told me why my mother saw sacrifice the way she did. When my grandmother developed Parkinson's disease, my mother was 26. Cynthia was newly married and already pregnant with Mason. My mother moved back into her parents' house for almost 3 years to provide daily care. She postponed nursing school. She spent most of her savings on home aids, medications, and a bathroom renovation. Cynthia visited, but my mother did the work. When my grandmother died, their parents' small lake property went almost entirely to Cynthia because she had a baby and needed a start. My mother received a few pieces of jewelry and the dining set. She never got over it, my father said. I felt something inside me shift. Not forgiveness. Recognition. My mother had once been the daughter whose strength was used as proof that she needed less. She had not broken the pattern. She had inherited it. Why didn't you ever tell me? I asked. Wasn't my story. You watched her do the same thing to me. His face tightened. Yes. That single word mattered more than excuses would have. I waited. He looked at me with wet eyes and said, I should have stopped it. I told him I loved him, but the mortgage payment was not coming back. He nodded. I worked. I went to therapy for the first time in my life. I told the therapist, Dr. Simone Price, that I was there because my family had become complicated. She raised one eyebrow and waited. By the 4th session, I was describing the trust meeting while crying so hard I had to stop twice. What did you believe would happen if you stopped helping? She asked. They'd think I was selfish. And if they did? The answer rose so quickly it embarrassed me. They might stop loving me. There it was. The mortgage had never been only a mortgage. Money had become the monthly ritual by which I reassured myself I was still a good daughter. Stopping the payment forced me to discover whether there was a relationship underneath the service I provided? The answer was painful, but not entirely empty. In late August, at 3:17 in the morning, my mother called. I answered on the first ring. "Your father collapsed," she said. Her voice was stripped of every practiced tone I had ever known. I was in my car in 6 minutes. At the hospital, my father was in intensive care with acute heart failure. Tubes, monitors, oxygen, the soft mechanical noise of machines doing their best to negotiate with the body. My mother stood outside the room in a cardigan over her nightgown. When she saw me, relief crossed her face. Then something defensive replaced it. "You came," she said. "Of course I came." Her eyes dropped to my purse. For one terrible second, I knew what she was thinking before she spoke. The hospital deposit. I held up my hand. "No." She stared at me. "I'm here for Dad. I'm not discussing money in this hallway." Her mouth tightened. "Everything becomes a boundary with you now." Because everything used to become a bill. The words came out before I could soften them. Pain flashed across her face. I regretted the timing. I did not regret the truth. I walked into my father's room. He was awake but weak. His skin looked gray against the pillow. When he saw me, he lifted 2 fingers from the blanket. I took his hand. For a long time, we said nothing. Then he whispered, "Shop key." I nodded. "Still have it." "Good." He closed his eyes. A few minutes later, he opened them again. "You don't have to earn your place," he said. His voice was so faint I leaned close. I felt my throat close. "Dad." He squeezed my fingers once. That's what I should have said years ago. He lived another 4 days. On the 4th night, his heart stopped while my mother was sleeping in a chair near the window, and I was downstairs buying coffee I did not want. A nurse met me at the elevator. There are moments when the world changes before anyone tells you. You see it in a stranger's face, and your body knows first. My father was 69. For the next week, grief erased time. At the funeral reception, Cynthia loudly suggested that my refusal to pay had added to my father's stress. I turned toward her. I said, "Tell them why my parents borrowed against the house 7 years ago." The room around us quieted by degrees. Cynthia's face changed. "Not here, Paige." "You brought money, NTO Dad's funeral." Then I said, "Tell them about the $92,000 my parents gave Mason." Cynthia said, "That was private family business." "So were my payments, until you made my finances public." Mason appeared beside her. "This is insane." I looked at him. "Did my parents refinance the house to give you money for Forge House?" His jaw tightened. "It wasn't like that." "How much did you repay?" "Pay? How much?" He did not answer. Gerald walked over slowly. He had heard enough. "Is that why Daniel had a new mortgage?" he asked. My mother said, "Please, not today." I looked at her, and my anger disappeared for a moment beneath grief. She had just buried her husband. I had just buried my father. This was ugly. But I had not chosen the setting. I took out my phone, opened a folder of saved statements, and showed Gerald the monthly transfers. I did not pass the phone around. I did not make a speech. I said, I covered the loan for 7 years. That's why I stopped after they gave the house to Mason in the trust. Gerald looked from me to my mother. His face went still. How much? Mortgage alone, just under $139,000. A woman at the next table inhaled sharply. Cynthia said, she is counting gifts like debts. I turned to her. No, I'm correcting the story you told about me. Then I walked outside. Tessa was waiting near the side entrance because she had come to the service, even though she had met my father only twice. She took one look at me and opened her arms. I cried against her shoulder in a church parking lot, while relatives I barely knew drove away with casseroles. That was the first time I understood chosen family, not as a sentimental phrase, but as a physical fact. It is the person who comes without an invoice. The funeral disclosure changed everything and fixed almost nothing. Within days, relatives began asking questions. One cousin worked for a title company and found the recorded refinance. Another remembered Mason bragging years earlier that his family had backed his studio. Gerald asked my mother directly whether I had made the mortgage payments. She admitted I had. The extended family story shifted quickly. Too quickly, in some ways. People who had judged me sent apologies. A cousin who had called me cold wrote 3 paragraphs about not knowing the full situation. An aunt mailed me a sympathy card with a second note tucked inside saying, "I'm sorry I believed what I heard." I appreciated the apologies. I also learned that vindication does not feel like victory when the person you most wanted to understand you is dead. By winter, the mortgage problem had become a foreclosure problem. My mother had options earlier. She could have sold the house while there was still time and equity. Gerald encouraged her to do exactly that. She refused. She said she could not sell the home where my father had died. Technically, he had died at the hospital, but grief does not care about technical accuracy. Cynthia proposed that several relatives contribute enough to catch up the loan. Relatives who now knew why the debt existed suddenly became less enthusiastic about collective sacrifice. Mason said he was trying to help, but had credit card problems. He and Brooke separated around Christmas. I did not celebrate that. 2 children were involved, and I had learned enough about family damage to know adults rarely contain the consequences they create. My mother called me occasionally during those months. Our conversations were short and unstable. Sometimes she asked about my work as if nothing had happened. Sometimes she accused me of letting strangers take my father's home. Once she said, "I hope you're happy now." I surprised both of us by answering honestly, "I'm not happy about any of this." "Then fix it." "No." "How can you say you love me?" "I can love you and still say no." She hung up. I cried afterward. Again, boundaries did not make me invulnerable. They made me honest. In January, Elise Carver's office contacted me. My mother wanted a meeting. I nearly refused, but Gerald encouraged me to go. In the conference room, Elise explained that a little over $24,000 would stop the sale if someone paid the arrears and costs. Everyone knew I had the money. Then Elise slid a document toward me. My mother was prepared to amend the trust. If I paid the arrears and resumed the mortgage, the house would pass to me instead of Mason. The offer I had once begged them to formalize was finally on paper. My mother leaned toward me. "Paige, this solves everything." I looked at her. "Does it? You wanted security. Here it is." Mason stared at the table. Cynthia said nothing. My mother continued. "We can stop hurting each other. Your father would want the house kept in the family." I felt my chest tighten. Using my father was unfair. The fact that some part of me desperately wanted to believe her was worse. I asked for 2 days. No one liked that, but Elise agreed. I drove home with a copy of the proposed amendment in my passenger seat. For 48 hours, I became 2 people. One was the daughter who wanted Hawthorne Lane. She wanted the porch where my father drank coffee on summer mornings. She wanted the oak tree. She wanted the kitchen cabinet where my mother still kept a chipped mug I made in 5th grade art class. She wanted to preserve one place where our family had once felt ordinary. That daughter told me $24,000 was less than I had already spent. She told me I could afford it. She told me the house might appreciate. She told me my mother would be safe. She told me my father's workshop would remain accessible. She told me this was finally proof that I had mattered all along. The other person in me asked harder questions. Why did I matter only after the bank became dangerous? Why had fairness changed only when the previous plan failed? Why was I being offered ownership only if I first restored the role that had exhausted me? And most importantly, if I paid, would the next request truly be the last one? I knew the answer. There is always another repair, another tax bill, another emergency, another reason a responsible daughter should step in. The document changed the beneficiary. It did not change the family system. On the second night, unable to sleep, I drove to Bellwether. I parked down the street from Hawthorne Lane because I did not want to wake my mother. The house was dark except for the porch light. I used the red-capped key to enter my father's workshop. The air smelled like sawdust, metal, and the peppermint candies he kept in a jar near the radio. His work jacket still hung on a hook. For a while I could not move. Grief is strange around objects. A hospital bed had not made me expect him to walk through a door. His old gloves did. Then I noticed a large canvas drop cloth over something near the back wall. I pulled it away. Underneath was a dining table. Not finished, not even close. A thick walnut top rested on sawhorses. 2 legs were attached. 2 more lay on the floor beside clamps and a box of hardware. The wood had been sanded smooth in some places and remained rough in others. I knew immediately that my father had built it. He had made furniture as a hobby when I was a child. Small things. Shelves, stools, a toy chest. He had not attempted anything this large in years. On the underside of the tabletop, written in pencil, were measurements, dates, and 1 line in his block handwriting. Paige, first table in her own place. I sat down on the concrete floor. There was no speech from beyond the grave, no miraculous letter explaining every regret, just 6 words and a half-built table. but they rearranged something in me. My father had not written for Hawthorne Lane. He had written her own place. Not the place we chose for you. Not the house you paid to preserve. Your own. I put both hands over my face and cried so hard my ribs hurt. Then, because grief makes ordinary tasks sacred, I found the parts he had labeled, stacked them carefully, and took photographs of every joint before covering the table again. On a shelf nearby, I found a small notebook with hardware lists and sketches. Tucked inside was a receipt for the walnut, dated 6 weeks before his hospitalization. At the bottom, in my father's handwriting, he had written, "Finish with Paige if I can." He had not gotten the chance. But suddenly, I knew what I wanted to do. The next afternoon, I returned to Elise Carver's office with the unsigned amendment, my old house key, and 1 page of records. I told them I would not pay the arrears or accept the house. It was not an invoice. It was a summary I had made for myself, 84 mortgage payments, major repairs, insurance, and the other expenses I had covered. I did not include interest. I did not demand repayment. At the bottom, I had written 1 sentence. My financial support for Hawthorne Lane ends here. My mother read it. Her lips parted. You made a list. I kept records. Cynthia shook her head. This is exactly the problem. Families aren't contracts. I turned to her. Then stop handing me contracts only when you need my money. She flushed. Mason muttered, "Unbelievable." I looked at him. You are still the person this trust was designed to benefit. If you believe the house matters this much, save it. I can't pull 24 grand out of nowhere. Neither could I 7 years ago. I changed my life so I could. He looked away. My mother began to cry. That was the hardest part. Not Cynthia's anger, not Mason's contempt. My mother's tears still reached directly into the oldest part of me, the part trained to fix discomfort before I even understood its cause. She said, "Your father would be ashamed of what this family has become." I nearly broke. Then I remembered the unfinished table. No, I said quietly. Dad was ashamed he didn't speak sooner. Her head snapped up. I had never told her what he said at breakfast or in the hospital. I did not weaponize every detail. Some things belonged to me and my father. But I said enough. He told me I never had to earn my place. I believe him now. My mother wiped her face. You think I made you earn being my daughter? I looked at her for a long time. I think you learned that love means the strongest woman carries everyone else until she has nothing left. I think somebody taught you that when you were young, and I think you handed it to me like it was a family heirloom. The room became very still. Cynthia looked at my mother. My mother looked at the paper. Then she whispered, "You don't know what I gave up for my mother." I do. Her eyes lifted. Dad told me. Color drained from her face. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother not as the authority in the room, but as a daughter from another decade. 26, exhausted, caring for a sick parent, watching her sister inherit the security she had sacrificed to preserve. She had survived that injustice by turning it into a rule. Strong daughters give. Needy relatives receive. If the strong daughter suffers, that proves the giving was meaningful. I understood it. I refused it. What happened to you was wrong, I said. You should have been thanked. You should have been protected. You should not have lost your future because everyone assumed you could rebuild it. My mother started crying harder. I felt tears in my own eyes. Then I said the sentence that ended our old relationship. But I am not going to prove I love you by surviving the same thing. Cynthia stood so abruptly her chair rolled backward. She accused me of rewriting family history, of turning my father against them, of humiliating Mason, of punishing my widowed mother. I let her talk. For once, I did not confuse another person's intensity with authority. When she stopped, I placed the old house key beside the unsigned amendment. I won't be paying for Hawthorne Lane again, I said. I won't discuss this decision again either. Then I looked at my mother. If you need help finding an apartment, organizing paperwork, moving, or understanding your options, I will help. I am still your daughter, but I am done being the emergency fund. She stared at me like she did not recognize me. Maybe she didn't. I barely recognized myself. I left. The house was sold 3 months later. After the sale, my mother had to move into a smaller apartment complex on the south side of Bellwether. Cynthia, who had spent months insisting family must help family, suddenly had back problems on moving weekend. Mason was unavailable. Gerald called me. You don't have to do this, he said. I know. That was why I did. Tessa came with me. So did Jamal Reed, a colleague from work who had heard only enough of the story to know there were boxes and stairs. He showed up at 8 in the morning wearing work gloves and carrying breakfast biscuits for everyone. My mother looked surprised when she saw them. This is Tessa, I said, and Jamal. I know who Tessa is. Tessa smiled. Good to see you, Mrs. Rowan. There was no sarcasm in her voice. We moved my mother's life into a one-bedroom apartment with a small balcony facing a line of pine trees. I assembled a bookshelf. Jamal connected her television. Tessa unpacked the kitchen and somehow found a way to make 3 mismatched mugs look intentional. My mother watched us move around one another without keeping track of who had done more. At lunch, she said quietly, your friends are very kind. They are. Something in my voice made her look at me. I did not add the obvious lesson. I only told my mother that I would help with practical things, but I would not fund her life again. Our relationship became small after that. Small was an improvement. For most of my life, our relationship had been large and blurry. Every crisis crossed every boundary. Every need became shared. Every refusal became evidence of disloyalty. Now we had coffee twice a month. Sometimes we talked for 40 minutes and ran out of things to say. Sometimes she asked whether I was seeing anyone, and I told her to stop interviewing me for grandchildren. Once she apologized for making a comment about my salary. It was not the apology I wanted. The apology I wanted was enormous. It included the trust meeting, the money, the family smear campaign, the years of assumptions, and my father's silence. My mother was not capable of that apology then. Maybe she never will be. Therapy helped me stop treating her limitations as unfinished homework assigned to me. Gerald became family in a new way. He started inviting me to Sunday dinners at his house with his wife, Marjorie, their adult son, and whichever neighbors wandered in. Nobody assigned seats. Nobody compared cont. Rebutions. If I brought dessert, great. If I arrived empty-handed, nobody looked disappointed. The first few times, I felt uneasy. I kept asking what I could do. Marjorie finally handed me a glass of iced tea and said, "Paige, sitting down is something you can do." I laughed. Then I almost cried. It is embarrassing how revolutionary rest can feel when usefulness has been your identity. 6 months after Hawthorne Lane was sold, I made an offer on a house outside Charlotte. Nothing dramatic. 3 bedrooms, pale brick, a narrow backyard, 1 enormous maple tree, and a dining room that was technically too small for the table my father had started. I bought it anyway. At closing, I signed my name so many times my hand cramped. Every signature felt different from the signatures in Elise Carver's office. No one was promising me love. No one was asking me to prove loyalty. The documents simply said what was mine, what I owed, and what happened next. There was relief in that clarity. On my first weekend in the house, Gerald brought my father's unfinished table from the workshop. The buyer of Hawthorne Lane had allowed us to remove personal property before closing, and Gerald had stored the pieces in his garage. Jamal came with clamps. Tessa brought sandwiches, and absolutely no useful woodworking knowledge. Marjorie arrived with my father's old notebook, which she had found in a box Gerald forgot to unload. We spent 3 weekends finishing the table. Gerald showed me how my father had intended to secure the legs. Jamal repaired 1 warped support. I sanded the top until my shoulders ached. Tessa sat on the garage floor reading the assembly notes aloud in a fake documentary voice whenever the rest of us became too serious. I left the pencil writing underneath untouched. Paige, first table in her own place. When the finish dried, we carried it into the dining room. It barely fit. I loved it immediately. My mother has been to the house twice. The first visit lasted 20 minutes. She stood in the dining room staring at the table. "Your father made this?" she asked. "He started it." She touched the edge with 2 fingers. "He was working on something out there all summer." I waited. She swallowed. "He didn't tell me." No. For once, we were 2 women grieving the same man, without trying to decide whose grief was more legitimate. Before she left, she asked if she could see the writing underneath. I showed her. She read it and sat down slowly. "I thought Hawthorne Lane was your place," she said. "So did I." She looked around my dining room. "Is this?" I thought about the question. The mortgage is in my name. The title is in my name. The paint colors are mine. The backyard needs work, and the upstairs bathroom makes a knocking sound whenever the washing machine runs. But ownership was not the whole answer. "Yes," I said, "this is." My mother nodded. Then she said something I had waited years to hear, though not in the form I expected. "I think I was angry that you could leave." I did not speak. She kept looking at the table. When my mother needed me, I stayed. When Cynthia needed help, I stayed. When Mason was in trouble, I thought we all stayed. That's what I thought made us good. I sat across from her. Staying can be good. She looked up. So can leaving. Yes. She nodded again, but this time there were tears in her eyes. I don't know how to understand that yet. That was not an apology. But it was the first honest sentence she had given me about the system we had lived inside. I let it be enough for that day. And I can admit something else. Some nights, I still miss Hawthorne Lane so much it feels physical. I miss the sound of my father's boots in the kitchen. I miss my mother calling from the porch that dinner was ready. I miss the version of myself who believed that if she worked hard enough, paid enough, showed up enough, every promise would eventually become true. I do not hate that woman. She was trying to keep a family she loved. She just did not know she was allowed to keep herself too. The last document I have from Hawthorne Lane is not the trust. I threw my copy of that into a box with tax records and warranties. The document I keep is a photograph of the underside of my dining table, my father's pencil marks still visible beneath the finish. Sometimes after everyone leaves, I sit there alone with a cup of tea and look around the room. There are scratches on the floor now from the folding chairs, a wine stain under one placemat, a tiny nick on the table edge from the night Gerald dropped a serving spoon. Evidence of use. Evidence of people coming and going without anyone keeping a moral inventory. That matters to me. Because I used to think family was the place where you were most obligated. Now I think family, at its healthiest, is the place where your generosity can remain generosity because refusal is allowed. If saying no does. Troy's the relationship, then your yes may have been the only thing holding it together. That is a painful truth. It can also be a freeing one. I spent 7 years paying toward a house I thought would prove where I belonged. In the end, belonging arrived in a different house, around a table my father never got to finish, with people who did not require proof of purchase. And if you have ever confused being needed with being loved, I hope you remember this. You are allowed to find out what remains when you stop overpaying for your place in someone else's life. If this story brought someone to mind, pass it along to them. I'd also like to hear where you draw the line between helping family and losing yourself, so share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to After Silence Stories for more stories about broken trust, hard boundaries, and the families we choose after the silence. I'll meet you in the next story.